So let's dive into today's episode, which is something I've really wanted to do actually for a long time. And I think now is quite literally the best time to go into it because as we sit here post season 2, House of the Dragon, and pre the Dunk and Egg or Hedge Night show, a lot of people literally might be watching this, especially on YouTube, for the first time being like, I don't know any of the stuff you're about to be talking about because they are like, I want to get into Game of Thrones, but should I start with the main series? Should I dive into House of the Dragon, which is on currently, or should I look at the Hedge Knight, or maybe in the future you're looking at Aegon's Conquest or any of the other stuff? So I thought it'd be kind of interesting to go over all of the content that exists, as well as like places to start, because there's also a lot of different editions and audiobooks and some other kind of cool, fun versions of things that exist, and there's like board games, a lot of that stuff. So mostly gonna be focusing the books, but I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about like video games and stuff like that as well. So the main series of A Song of Ice and Fire, which is of course what this whole thing is called, consists of 5 books currently, and it's going to be 7 books. We think as we sit here in 2024, George is still writing the 5th book, Winds of Winter. And there's also a lot of cool stuff you can look at as when these books came out. And that will tie into some of the other stuff we'll be talking a little bit later about, like Dunk and Egg, because he was writing some of these things at the same time. That has, of course, changed maybe the way you want to read it or go about it. But I think we should start with the main series because that is, I think, the best jumping off point if you're looking to get into A Song of Ice and Fire, and then ultimately, the TV show Game of Thrones. Currently, 5 of the 7 published books. You have A Game of Thrones, A Clash of Kings, A Storm of Swords, A Feast for Crows, and A Dance with Dragons. And even inside of their reading order and stuff like that can get kind of interesting, to be entirely honest, if you're going to be diving into it. So, Game of Thrones first came out in 1996, and then you basically can go A Game of Thrones down to A Dance with Dragons straight through. Fun to do once you've read those books, because the books are told to us in point of view chapters. You actually, a lot of people, when they go back to read it again, will read specific characters' arcs. You could just be like, I just want to read the Jon Snow chapters, or I just want to read the Bran chapters, or the Arya chapters, however you want to do it. And that's kind of a fun way to dive down through the books on a reread. Where it gets a little interesting is actually with A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, because George was writing in a way those at the same time, and that's actually supposed to be just one book split into 2. So while A Game of Thrones and A Storm of Swords is essentially, you can read it chronologically, once you get to A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, some of the timeline of events is actually happening in a way back and forth. So you may be reading like a Cersei chapter, and then something like, well, hold on, this doesn't match up over here where this event has taken place or hasn't. That's kind of one thing to look at. And there's a great resource, and I have other resources we'll get to too, which I want to talk about, called Boiled Leather, which is actually a fan, mostly done on Reddit, breakdown that describes a good reading order for those if you actually want to read it in like chronological order, where you will be jumping back and forth between A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons. And again, this is something that's really meant for totally new people, but of course this is going to be a podcast and a YouTube video, so a lot of the people on the podcast have been following us for a long time, and we have been reading it's a reread for us, and we go chapter by chapter each week until the TV show comes back on or the big piece of news comes out. Currently, Jimmy and I are in A Storm of Swords, the 3rd book, and we are actually going to be doing the Boiled Leather read when we finish A Storm of Swords, maybe even later this year. And depends on when the Hedge Knight show comes out next year, but certainly next year when we're in A Feast for Crows, we're actually going to be doing it as a Boiled Leather read. So we will be going back and forth between A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons.
Yeah, that's going to be really interesting because of the 7 times I think I've read through the series, I've actually never got to do just the mixed reading order. And I think doing it on the podcast will be nice because we're going chapter by chapter. So it'll be very fun to jump between Feast and Dance like that.
Yeah, and I've never done that read as well. In fact, actually, A Feast for Crows and Dance with Dragons are the books that I have read the least. I've read Storm of Swords several times, but A Feast for Crows and Dance with Dragons are the books I have read by far the least.
Yeah, I think that those are the two books that improve the most on reread, especially because so many of the threads of the first three books actually get resolved in Storm of Swords. Whereas when you reread A Feast for Crows, A Dance of Dragons without Winds of Winter, a lot of stuff is still left open, but you catch a lot of small details, like the not Brother Without Banners, technically, that Lady Stoneheart has agents inside of Riverrun talking to Jaime Lannister, being around Jaime Lannister and knowing the movings and all these things, and people are going missing and stuff you can really miss on the first time you read. So I think,
Yeah.
especially doing it in a boiled leather way, we're probably going to be able to put together some stuff a little easier. And we know that the order of POVs has always been very important. Obviously, doing it in this mixed up way, we won't have that exact context, but it will make chronological sense, which will be a different experience.
There is also, as well, a little bit of overlap in a Samwell Tarly chapter and a Jon Snow chapter where you actually get the same event from different points of view, which does not happen in the rest of the series because it's sort of chronological. So just another kind of interesting thing. Then after that, there is, of course, The Winds of Winter, which is the long-awaited book we're still waiting on for George R. R. Martin to finish. He finished Dance of Dragons in 2011. He's been writing Winds for a very long time. You could write books on just his entire process of talking about how he's been writing Winds of Winter. And that, of course, is the book that caused the big issue with the TV adaptation, and that they ran out of content. So they have outlines and points and things like that they were making up for some of the final few seasons there, but the books may be quite different. Now, there is a little bit of Winds of Winter content that does exist. George Martin has released sample chapters. I have always viewed those as not canon. I know some people do, but in some of George Martin's blog posts about the Winds of Winter chapters, he's even said that some of that stuff has been rewritten. So I think it's likely that the core points of those chapters are what we will see in the book, and a lot of that does sort of follow the plot line in the show as well. And the show, you can kind of view and be like, well, maybe that's some of the stuff that's going to happen, which is what we honestly speculate about pretty much the most on our podcast.
Yeah.
Is what can we pull from the show to be like, this may or may not happen in the books. But so a lot of those are published online. There isn't like a official book you can go buy that contains those chapters, but a lot of those he has published himself and other people have put out, and you can find like the full chapter reads of those that exist in some of the resources we'll get to as well. So if you do want to read those, then they do exist online, but just I would take them with somewhat of a grain of salt that some of that stuff may be changed, or perhaps all of it.
Yeah, and I will say that two of the chapters are some of his best writing. Like, I literally think Mercy might be the best chapter he's written. I think it's tremendous. So he's got some heaters out there. We just would love to see the book. That'd be great.
And then, of course, the final book is supposed to be A Dream of Spring, which we don't even know if we'll ever get, to be entirely honest.
I wouldn't bet on it. I would not bet on it at this point.
Yeah. So if you are looking to buy those books, there are several versions and editions that exist. To me, the one that always stands out is like for the Game of Thrones book, the blue cover, which you can typically get in a box set, which is the blue cover and the dagger. There are some older editions out there that do have some pretty cool artwork.
Oh, yeah.
And then there are illustrated versions that they're getting released every so often that have some cool artwork. And I believe it's done from the same artist that did work on the Fire and Blood, those black and white pages, and they're very cool. To me, the version I like is just that blue. It's like the blue, and then Clash of Kings is yellow and Storm of Swords is green. It's sort of like a box set. But now there's also a lot of versions that exist that have like TV HBO artwork on them.
Yeah, and there's a new run coming out this holiday season, which will be the new.
Cool.
Yeah, I think it looked pretty nice. That will be the new mass release. So when you go to in the store, you'll see those from now on. I think
that artwork, I don't know if it's the same person who does it, but it reminds me of the more recent re-release of the Lord of the Rings books, where it's like that black cover and it's got the mountain, and it's very sort of similar. And I haven't bought those books. I do like that artwork. And then of course you could go down the Jimmy route and get like what's the version that you have, Jimmy? The like ultra.
So I have the full set from Folio Society, which they're depending on the sales they run or whatever, they can be pretty expensive, up to $200 a book. But I'm also a book collector as a hobby, so I also have my backdrop is quite a few books. But also I do own the first two books in Subterranean Press, which is one of the hardest versions to get outside of Misha Merlin. But good luck trying to find those in singles and at prices that won't make you vomit. Those are not for the faint of heart. If you're a book collector, though, I mean, definitely something that you would consider. And also, they're probably as cheap as they will ever be, because once authors pass away, they usually spike massively in price. So, for the book fiends out there, you can definitely find some of the nicer editions. The Misha Merlin are the ones I would recommend getting if you can find them. But again, good luck.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, so that is the core series, and that is what you can tie with the Game of Thrones TV show adaptation.
Mhm.
Where we're sort of currently at gets a little more interesting. So, the current show we just finished was season 2 of House of the Dragon. We know we're getting season 3 and season 4, and that show will end.
Mhm.
That is when you begin to dive into the sort of lore books and novellas. Okay. So those, I actually have some of them right here next to me. The first one, and this things get a little interesting here because a lot of this content has been released multiple times in different versions. To say the book, I would recommend people who maybe if you've read Game of Thrones and you're like, I want to know more about this world, or even if you liked House of the Dragon and you're like, I want to know more about the lore of the world of Ice and Fire and the Westeros and Essos, then I would actually recommend moving on to the World of Ice and Fire book. Now, a lot of the content in here is really cool. It's a big hard. It is a hardcover, but it's actually this sort of like plush. I don't know how you describe it. It's padded. It's really even. I have another book that has a similar cover, but it's different. It's like this. It's kind of squishy, actually. I don't really know what it is that's going on with this cover, but I do really like it. And it's like a tabletop book. There's an amazing artwork in here, but it is a lore book and it goes over all of the different ages. I mean, it goes back thousands of years, all the way up until essentially where Game of Thrones starts, right, with Robert Baratheon. And it's tells you a lot about the Targaryen history, goes over all of the kings and everything, and then also dives into, it has some maps and it has little snippets about all of the different regions like the Reach and the North and even Essos and things like that. And it's just a really, really cool book, and I really, really like it. And it still has some of the content that exist in some of the other books like Fire and Blood, which is more of a history book, and it expands out some of the novellas, which I'll talk about here in a second as well. But it has its own version of essentially the World of Ice and Fire, which is called Rise of the Dragon. And I'll, through in post editing, post a nicer thing of it as well. But Rise of the Dragon is Fire and Blood, just in this World of Ice and Fire telling. So you do actually have some options in how you want to access this content, which is really, really cool. But this does not cover all of the Targaryen kings. It essentially goes to the end of what House of the Dragon will be, the dance of the event that is known as the Dance of the Dragons. And it starts with Aegon. So it's really like more Targaryen history, and it expands further the World of Ice and Fire. So a lot of the kings you'd hear about in the World of Ice and Fire, in some of those are like a page, a 2-page, more of like, think of like a Wikipedia, just quick read about it. Whereas this goes into like detail about a lot of those kings up until the Dance of the Dragons. Now that contains what are, novellas. I don't really know what a novella actually just is in its own right, but George, a lot of these fantasy authors wrote smaller passages or stories that would appear in a lot of like publications grouped together, and I'll dive into some of these here.
Yeah, novella is about 20 to 50,000 words, roughly. I mean, it is essentially like a miniature version of a novel, but it's not quite a short story. I mean, that's really, there's also novelette, but most people just say novella and kind of move on,
Inside of whether you get the Fire and Blood, smaller book, or you get the bigger book with artwork, which is, again, I like, but Fire and Blood does have artwork, but it's not nearly as cool and as detailed as this. It contains several novellas, which include The Princess and the Queen, the Rogue Prince, and Sons of the Dragon. So The Princess and the Queen and the Rogue Prince are two novellas that take place inside of the Dance of the Dragons. Both of those are actually published in here, as well as the Sons of the Dragon, which was a novella, and he published it in here, and it's like the second and third Targaryen king. So You can actually find those in other books. So The Princess and the Queen is in a thing called Dangerous Women, and The Rogue Prince is in another one called Rogues, where George was writing these little novellas that appeared with other people. Some of them are just standalone short stories. Some of them are other parts of other series, kind of like George did. But those versions actually, from what I could even read a little bit of in those and wanted to find online, are more expanded upon in this and Fire and Blood, same as the Sons of the Dragon. So there's another book coming out, which is essentially going to be Fire and Blood Part 2, which is going to be called Blood and Fire, which I would imagine would be the second half of World of Ice and Fire, which is up until Robert Baratheon takes over and starts Game of Thrones. And of course, we haven't seen that book yet, but I would also imagine they would publish a new version, say, of Rise of the Dragon, which is going to be that big, nicer tabletop, which is probably what I will hold out and wait to buy. I mean, I own the books all on Kindle. I don't actually own that many physical copies of a lot of these books. That would be the version that I would hate on. Did you have you? I mean, which do you read Rise of the Dragon, Jimmy, or do you just read Fire and Blood, or what?
I just read Fire and Blood in the World of Ice and Fire. I mean, I have Rise of the Dragon, and I've looked through the art of it. The art, really, you're buying it for the art, to be honest. Like it's one of those books that's beautiful to flip through. Sometimes I'll have a glass of Game of Thrones scotch because I have all those, and I'll just flip through it and stare at them. But one of my favorite things to do is just pick a random section in World of Ice and Fire and just read a section and then ruminate on it. There's a lot packed in there, man.
Yeah, and we'll talk about the audiobooks here in a little bit once we get past Dunk and Egg. Now, there are a couple of other novellas which are kind of cool, and I actually have been looking for them, but man, they're really difficult to find. So there is one called Path of the Dragon, which came out in 2000, and it's like a section of a Daenerys chapter and some of like this Daenerys chapters. And it did actually get its own publication, but man, finding it online, like people are selling it on eBay for like 100, $200. And I mean, it's literally just like a chapter of, like a Daenerys chapter, I believe from A Storm of Swords, that's just published. And so it's like, all right, well, I don't know that I specifically want that thing, but if you happen to be in a half price books and see it, and you're like for really cheap, and you're like, I mean, one, you could maybe sell it for a lot more, or two, you're just looking for like a cool Game of Thrones collectible.
Well,
that's pretty. Do you have it?
No, but I have something else that's kind of interesting. So if you go look at the old issues, the first editions of Game of Thrones, Storm of Sword, all this stuff, right? Clash Kings. There was a certain artist, and I forget his name currently, but it was like kind of like a picture on the front. One of them has like Cersei near the throne with someone bending the knee.
I think that's the second edition publication.
Yeah, so like they're very famous covers. Well, fun fact is, A Feast for Crows actually had that same artist, but only for like 500 of the books, and they stopped the run and canceled it because they didn't want to pay the artist, or he didn't have rights or something like this. I have one of the covers. I have the dust jacket, and it's an extremely rare item, and it's worth a whole lot of money because there's only 500 of them, and I have a mint condition one.
Are you gonna sell it, or
I'm keeping it until I die.
Yeah. You're just holding on. just
yeah. It's the rarest dust jacket in a Song of Ice and Fire fandom, and it's just one of those nerdy things that I love.
Yeah. Well, hey, this Path of the Dragon is also kind of rare. There's another one too called Arms of the Kraken, which is a Euron chapter. Again, it just got its sort of own publication. You can check that out. Same type of thing. They're both really hard to find. It's just I think it's just sort of a novelty item because you can get it in obviously the main series, but they do exist and they are out there. And I just think it's kind of cool. So after that, you can move into, and maybe this is actually where a lot of people might want to start, right? Like if you're watching this as the time we're releasing this, because the next big event we're getting is the television show of the Hedge Knight, or a Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, or as it's more kind of commonly referred to in the franchise as Dunk and Egg, for Sir Duncan the Tall and Aegon are the characters. So if you see that wording and you're like, what's Dunk and Egg? That's what it is. So it is actually 3 stories, which is supposed to be 7, just like the main series. We don't know if George will ever get to these, which kind of puts us in an interesting spot with that TV show if we ever get that.
Certainly.
Yeah, and I think the best way to buy that now is with this, which is the Knight of the Seven Kingdoms book. It's really cool, has artwork here and there, but it contains all 3 of those stories, which are the Hedge Knight, the Sworn Sword, and the Mystery Knight. Now, the cool thing about these stories, just one on their own, I really like them, and it's actually my favorite part of all of A Song of Ice and Fire. It's a little lighter in tone. No, I mean, it's still Westeros, but it's just, it feels a little lighter. Like, I would almost say, like, if you were to read a teen version of A Song of Ice and Fire, this would be it. I mean, there's definitely still blood and sex and, all of that, but it does feel a little lighter. I don't know that you could find those where you would find those just on their own, like, written publication. I mean, I kind of looked and I really don't know. There are graphic novels that exist of these, and there's a couple different prints. There's like the old school, I think there's like 3 or 4 different artworks, and I think Europe got their own as well. Newer versions of it, like here's the Sworn Sword. This is sort of what the current publication of it looks like if you want it. I really like the graphic novels. They don't obviously contain everything, but I do think they're really, really cool. And this is more one with like the older publication of the Hedge Knight. I do not have the third one, but I want to get it at some point. But those exist as well. And I think that will take us into the audiobooks, where audiobooks of the Dunk and Egg series or the Hedge Knight, Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is what I consider to be almost the best like part of the whole franchise in terms of the books, because it's narrated by Harry Lloyd, who plays Viserys Targaryen in Game of Thrones. And he is just an amazing, phenomenal audiobook voice reader. I mean, it's so good. I think it's the best. I think it's by far the best voice narration of any of the audiobooks. The Game of Thrones and main series audiobooks can be a little hit and miss with Roy Dotrice, who reads them, just because book by book he sometimes changes character names, and so it can get a little confusing, right?
Oh yeah.
I mean, yeah. So that as well. And then the World of Ice and Fire and Fire and Blood, those are a little different in that they are told by maesters. I should have mentioned this on their section. So they're like history books told by multiple sources. So even inside of those, you do have to kind of be like, is this a reliable narrator or an unreliable narrator? Even in sort of this like history guidebook, which is one of the reasons I am not particularly fond of Fire and Blood. Just as a read, to me, I don't like it as much as I like the World of Ice and Fire, where that feels more like you're just reading like a Wikipedia page essentially. But I think you like Fire and Blood more than I do, Jimmy.
Yeah, I think it's quite impressive for what it actually does. Especially, it has no right to be as interesting as it is, but George is just such a good writer that he's using, almost this device of a history book and then somehow making that come alive, which is really impressive. So from a literary perspective, I think it's actually quite the achievement.
As a history book, like it's really, really cool and really, really interesting, and it does make like speculation where we're at currently of like, how is this going to go? Because the maesters that are writing it, right, which are are they being reliable about some of the things they're saying? And now we're seeing the TV show, and they give another account, which is this character Mushroom, obviously, who's like a court jester, and he's a lot more frank in how he describes things, and so there will be compelling arguments back and forth, like, well, the maesters of the time said this is the way like this character died, and then the Mushroom will say, well, actually I think it was this.
Yes.
Right? Or like this character was sleeping at this one, and Mushroom's like, nah, that's not what's happening. So it is kind of like a cool, interesting, and I do think it adds a little bit of flavor to it to keep it
definitely
interesting.
It's also
it's
pretty
really
interesting.
unique.
Yeah, it's very unique, even in the fantasy landscape. I mean, the thing that people compare it to is the Silmarillion. They call it the Gurmarillion, but even then, it's very, very different, and it doesn't deal with a whole lot of lore per se of like the magic of the world creation and whatever. But I think that one of the things that's interesting about Fire and Blood with, remember that it was ordered to be written underneath King Robert Baratheon, so there's like biases written into the, what I mean? You have to think, okay, well, Bobby B got it ordered, so like the Targaryens will be painting in a pretty negative light because Robert hates them, right? So it's like there's a whole meta aspect to it that's really impressive.
And
it's
even
cool.
between World of Ice and Fire and Blood, there are some discrepancies.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, so I think that the most underrated book in the series is The World of Ice and Fire, because I think a lot of people think it's just pretty pictures, but like there's a lot of stuff in there, and it's very intentional of what George wanted to put in the book. So I think that like it's one of the most untapped resources as far as speculation and discussion goes. But Fire and Blood has to be, for me, like maybe 2 behind that. But a lot more people, I think, have read Fire and Blood than World of Ice and Fire. I think a lot of people think it's just all the same, which there are tidbits, but there's so much more in World of Ice and Fire about the Children of the Forest, about the Wall's creation, about the First Men, and all this other thing. So I always tell people, man, don't sleep on World of Ice and Fire. It's important.
Yeah, the audiobooks for that and one of the reasons I like the audiobook of World of Ice and Fire more than Fire and Blood as well, is that the audiobook for World of Ice and Fire has two different people, so they even go back and forth. So it also just keeps it a little more fresh because you're listening to it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. I will say, and you can find, so even inside of that, I said there's the novellas for Princess of the Queen and the Rogue Prince. There are audiobook versions of that, which you can find, I believe you can just find them on YouTube, that are narrated by Ian Glenn, who plays Jorah Mormont in Game of Thrones.
Excellent.
So you can actually go listen to him read those, which is pretty cool. And I think people are just like, illegally uploaded those on YouTube, but those do exist as well. Okay. So continuing on with the graphic novels, there are actually graphic novels of Game of Thrones and A Clash of Kings. I think they were supposed to do the whole series, but they just stopped. And so they do exist. I flipped through them. They're kind of cool. Personally, I don't really feel any need to own them, especially since they didn't do the whole thing, but they are out there. They do exist, and they're definitely cool for what they are. There's some other fun books and resources that exist. There's The Lands of Ice and Fire, which came out when the show did, and it's like an official map collection. Actually, as Ezra had it, and it's really, really, really cool. I mean, it's a lot of really good, like high quality maps. If that's something you're really into and like want to have them hanging in your room, like maybe I should do, since I use it all the time. But I mean, it's really, really cool. I don't know if they're still printing it. I can't imagine they're not. So you're probably looking for like a secondhand, half price books or something like that. And then are you going to get it in a good condition? But if you can find it, it's really, really cool.
It is a great way if you're rereading it and you really want to get immersed and you're someone that likes to take your time. You can actually move people around on the map. I mean, you would have to have like pins and stuff, but you could take the map, put it up, and then trace. You'll be surprised.
There's a lot of maps.
Yeah. Oh, there's like micro maps of areas and stuff. It is incredible. I mean, I love it.
Yeah.
I'm a nerd.
Is that the map? What is the map that's behind you?
That is Middle Earth, and it was made by someone in the Ukraine.
Okay.
The lady, when I messaged her, I was like, hey, it's taking a while. She's like, I literally hand make it, and I have to put it on a wagon to go to somewhere that has a post office. And I was like, oh, my bad. Shouldn't have rushed you. Okay. It's like one of the cooler things I have. I do have a 3D puzzle map of Westeros, though, that has like elevated things that come off of it. One day I'll have to show it to you, but it is not for the faint of heart. It took me weeks to put together, and I don't know if I'd recommend it, to be honest.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Okay, some other things. There is a little book called The Wit and Wisdom of Tyrion Lannister, which is kind of fun, and it's just a tiny little book. I don't have it, and it's literally just one-liners from the Tyrion. It's certainly like one if you're in Barnes and Noble or something and you see it and you pick it up and you kind of flip through it. It's kind of fun. I don't know that I would buy it for any reason, because I'd have to like leave it at my coffee table and hope people have seen Game of Thrones and really like Tyrion, and so it's like kind of a very niche item, but it does exist and it's kind of fun. There are a few official cookbooks. We've even done a few of these on the channel, a couple episodes of it, from the Feast of Ice and Fire. And there's also one which they actually just released this year called the official Game of Thrones cookbook. And I think that's more focusing on the TV show, unlike some of the things we see in the TV show, where the Feast of Ice and Fire actually takes sections from the books. It's like, hey, here's the line in the book where they did this. And it's kind of cool because it actually uses, like, they provide you often with two different ways to make it. One is like, this is how they would have made it in medieval times. Like you would have I forget, I'm blanking on what it's called right now, but it's like a special type of flour the way they would have made flour back then. So it's pretty cool. And the official Game of Thrones cookbook, it's done by the same author, came out earlier this year, if you want to check that out. And then there's what's the Hodor novel, Jimmy?
Oh, so there's a book, it's called Hodor, My Journey, and it's 180 pages of the word Hodor. And it has him on the cover, and I own it, and it's a great read.
Okay, yeah, I forgot about that one. That one does exist. Yeah. Yeah, I need to get that just as a joke. That one's
I'm gonna do a book review for it this year on April Fool's, I think, on my YouTube channel.
Let's go.
And just talk very poetically about it. Just like the prose was so rich. Just like, it'll be funny.
Yeah. Okay, some really good resources. So the A Song of Ice and Fire wiki. Yes, us. Yep. That's place number one. You should be going. It's us. But as well, the A Song of Ice and Fire wiki, I think, is really good. It's actually made by the same people who have worked on Fire and Blood and stuff like that. Elio and I forget
Linda.
Linda. Yeah, they. I mean, I don't know them. I've never met them, but I know that the fandom is a little split on them, just their personal stuff on Twitter and stuff like that. I don't really know that much into it, except that some fans really like them and some don't. But either way, the wiki is really good, and they've obviously done great work in the books themselves. There is also a great resource called a Search of Ice and Fire, which is a great search engine, which will allow you to type in like anything you want into it, and it'll pull up like anytime. Like you could literally type in like a word and see how many times that word is referenced in all of the fandom. It's a great reference.
Fantastic resource.
Yeah. And there's one other book I want to talk about here before we dive into like where should maybe people go. And it is a book by George Martin, which was written in 1980. So years before he wrote Game of Thrones. And it is called The Ice Dragon. Jimmy and I have covered this. This is not canon to Game of Thrones or anything. But it's very obvious that you can see the early ideas of Game of Thrones and Westeros, especially like the North and the White Walkers, in this book that he wrote. And some publications will actually say that it is part of Game of Thrones and it is part of Westeros, but it is very much not so.
Yeah,
it's
very deceptive.
Yeah, it's actually just a very cool short story, and it involves this girl who like has an ice dragon, and she, you know, I mean, it's very Game of Thrones. Like if you wanted to say that this was like a story that say like old Nan would tell, it about like a wildling girl or something like that. It would immediately fit right in, but it is without question not canon. But it's very obvious George had this in the back of his mind when he was writing Game of Thrones, because Game of Thrones came about of the first chapter, the Bran chapter. He's like, I thought about this kid sitting there with his father who has to behead this man. And then he's probably like, well, actually, I can take some ideas from this and combine them. So this is definitely a cool story. It's actually just a good story on its own.
Yeah, it's a children's novel mostly, but like you can read it and enjoy it. They're also making a series for it, or a movie.
Yeah, they're going to make an animated thing. So
it'll be really good.
Yeah, there's some video games that exist. Most of them are not particularly good. One of them looked like it was going to be the Telltale series, which they did games like The Walking Dead and stuff like that. It was fun. It seemed like it was going to get turned into more games, and then nothing ever happened with it. So
yeah, Telltale went out of business. Now they're back, but they don't have the license. So I don't think we're ever doing that. Here's a random recommendation as an avid reader. Folks, I know we love A Song of Ice and Fire, but George has written a lot of other stuff, including a vampire novel called Fever Dream that takes place in the 1800s down in Louisiana on the Mississippi on steamboats. It's phenomenal, as well as a plethora of horror and sci-fi short stories that I would highly recommend that you check out. There was a release of it called Gurm, a retrospective, and it includes all of his short fiction. Then it was released in mass market as the Dream Songs volumes, which I highly recommend that you check out. Specifically, the short story Sand Kings is considered one of the greatest sci-fi short fictions of all time. It actually won the Hugo and a Nebula, I think. But I can't recommend Sand Kings enough. Dying of the Light, which was his debut novel, also phenomenal. Armageddon Rag is also there. Song of Lysa. He has written so much stuff, so many things. And I find all of it to be at least interesting. He's my favorite author, even beyond A Song of Ice and Fire. So check those out. Yeah.
So, okay, with that, Jimmy, I just will have this real quick. It's one of the Game of Thrones board games. It's like a little card game.
Yeah. I have that.
It is pretty fun. And a lot of the artwork here, actually, if you look up characters that exist, like small characters, often on the wiki, this is the artwork they'll use because it's the only sort of like official artwork that exists for those characters. So you can certainly check that out. So I guess, Jimmy, where would you recommend people go right now? If you're...
I mean, if you're interested in all of it, you've seen the show, you're not turned off by some of the grimmer aspects, start Game of Thrones. I mean, start with the tried and true. I think publication order is almost always the right call. I think sprinkling in the other like the Dunk and Egg novels between the books is the best. I think publication reading order is the best reading order. I'll say that, especially for your first time through. However, if you're a fan, but you're not so sure you want to read about some of the tougher aspects of the series, I do think that Dunk and Egg is also a wonderful place to start the series, just because it's a little bit lighter, less of a commitment because they're short stories, essentially novellas, and you can get through all three of them in the time it would take you to read maybe a third of Game of Thrones.
The audiobook is 10 hours for all three stories.
For all three,
yeah, and it's also what's next.
Yeah,
so I mean,
that's true.
That's true. Yeah, it is also the next thing. So it depends on if you want to go into it with spoilers or not, but I also think it's a great entry point just into A Song of Ice and Fire to kind of get an idea of like
Mhm.
what this world is, because it's focused very much on just these really these two characters, but it's all told through Sir Duncan the Tall, who is this small little knight who ends up kind of basically stumbling into this grand adventure essentially. And I think it's a
Yeah.
really, really good place to kind of dip your toes in to see if this is something you think you're going to like without getting into like the deep, heavy lore of Game of Thrones and everything like that. Then, of course, there is Fire and Blood and World of Ice and Fire. Again, I will always preach World of Ice and Fire on before Fire and Blood. I really think Fire and Blood is a great place to just start reading. I mean, if you
No,
want,
no.
yeah, I think it's a great addition to the rest of the content, but I think it's thick. Like it's really kind of dry to me, at
It's
least
for the
personally.
diehards, mostly. I think also even World of Ice Fire, I would not read that till after you read the main series because
Or
the
I think you could read it if you do if you do want to do Dunk and Egg first, or you want to do the main series in terms of reading. I think those are the places I'd go for
yeah,
sure.
I'd agree.
And you want that expanded content. So
Yeah.
yeah. So I mean, anything else? Any other recommendations or things people should check out, Jimmy, with like with the books? I think we kind of covered all of the books and everything that kind of really exists out there.
Just remember, we have even back before me was Ezra, and there is a episode for every chapter up to where we are now. So you can go and experience it, and probably
Yeah.
have to skip through the small talk because it might not be relevant anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
But
There's a little bit of small talk certainly at the beginnings of some of those. And we actually went through World of Ice and Fire as well in those early episodes. We were doing both. Now, especially because I think a lot of people are maybe going to be listening to this because it's going to be on YouTube as well. So maybe this is like a beginner's guide to you for like everything that exists. So yeah, so what Jimmy and I do, and of course most people listening know this, is we are a reread podcast. So this is for people who have read the series and want to dive into like the nitty gritty details of like, oh, this line here ties into something. And
Mhm.
if you are new, maybe you watched Game of Thrones and you're like, I want to dive into the books, or you watched House of the Dragon, like maybe I should go watch Game of Thrones or any of that
Mhm.
stuff. The thing that I find so special about this series, especially in the books, is that literally every line matters. There's no other series I can even think of that comes close to the amount of, maybe One Piece. That's about the only other thing I can think of that. I mean,
Yeah,
you'll see like a small little thread here that comes back up way later, and you're like, wow, I did not expect that to be such a big thing.
yeah,
But
definitely. And this is why George is so particular about his adaptations.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So yeah, so where Jimmy and I are at currently, and where we will be next week, is diving back into our reread, and we are on. I have it
I think
pulled
it's
up here.
Jamie 4, I
No, we
think.
did. We did. Jamie 4 was the last chapter we did. So we are on chapter 32 of A Storm of Swords, which is Tyrion 4.
Oh, let's
In
go. A Tyrion
in
chapter to head back
yes,
into it? Oh,
yes,
I'm a happy boy.
is where we are at currently.
Love to see it.
So so that's where we will be next week. So maybe you just want to dive right in and listen to that. And we do also talk about the news and everything as that comes out as well, and have Patreon episodes diving deep into some of the lore and crazy theories and everything. But so I think for a lot of people, I was hoping this was sort of a good guide as to where to begin, where do I go, what all kind of exists out there. And there's even more. You can really dive into like there's other editions. I know in Europe some of the books are broken up, so you might see like a
Oh,
part 1, part 2, but I think the main core for what you're looking for we broke down.
go look at some of the German and Spanish covers of the series. Incredible.
Oh yeah. Yeah, the artwork in the European versions are definitely pretty sweet too. A lot of the stuff. I actually like their Rise of the Dragon cover better. I think it's cool. It's like
I generally
silver.
like UK/European covers more than American covers.
Yeah, I
But
think
yeah.
I think it's definitely pretty cool. So with that anyway, I hope that was sort of a good guide that exists, for you guys. The only other thing I can think of is is on the DVDs and Blu-rays of the original series, they do these little short tellings of some of the cool
History.
like histories and stuff like that, but it's read by the actors and they're in character reading them, which is really cool. So it's like Jamie Lannister telling you about Sir Duncan the Tall, or like
Cole.
exactly. So those are really cool stories as well. And you can find, I think, most of them on YouTube because they're pretty short, but it is just cool that they're told in character.
Yeah.
And so in a way it is kind of getting like extended lore that doesn't exist like anywhere else. So I don't know if it's like canon or not, but you do get sort of like that person's telling of the story, which is certainly a cool little novelty. But yeah, so anyway, hope this helped anybody who's looking to dive into A Song of Ice and Fire for the first time. Like I said, next week, Jimmy and I are in the third book, Storm of Swords, which will be chapter 32, Tyrion 4. So thank you guys as always for watching and listening. And remember that winter is coming.